Takes courage. It takes courage to say it and mean it. Hope is not some ethereal, floating thing, nor is courage. It is in real time. It is gritty. There's a passage from an old children's book that guides me when I need to muster up some courage. It's from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first book of C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia series. Children Peter, Susan, Lucy, and Edmund pass through their uncle's wardrobe into the fantastical world of Narnia. When we pick up the story, Edmund has joined ranks with the White Witch, a terrible being who makes it winter but never Christmas. The other three children seek help from Mr. and Mrs. Beaver in fighting the White Witch. The Beaver family agree to take the children to see King Aslan. Here's part of the conversation. "Is he quite safe?" asked Susan. "I shall feel rather nervous about meeting him." "That you will, dearie, and make no mistake," said Mrs. Beaver. "Then he isn't safe?" said Lucy. "Safe," said Mr. Beaver. "Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver is telling you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. Not safe, but good." Certainly Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was not safe. Selma, Alabama, 1965. We've all seen the photos. People's flesh being torn by fire hoses, gnawed by German shepherds, heads bashed by the nightsticks of Alabama state troopers. As horrible as all that was, it was certainly no accident. It was a tactic designed to put pressure on national leaders to expand the civil rights of African Americans. Hundreds of people had worn down the grass on the path to Selma. Many were black women, including Dorothy Height, whom President Obama called the godmother of the civil rights movement. There was Diane Nash, Fannie Lou Hamer, Septima Clark, whom Dr. King called the mother of the movement, who began working on civil rights for African Americans in 1919. They and so many more paved the road to Selma. The Selma marches were powerfully effective. The violence of the police and citizens of Alabama and the nonviolent reaction of the marchers was televised, and that was key. The nation watched the bloodshed. Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered by police, and there was a national outcry. The shooting death of Unitarian Universalist minister James Reeb in Selma was widely publicized, and King spoke at his funeral. UU layperson Viola Liuzzo was shot to death. Finally, public unrest led to action. In 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. It was designed to give African Americans the ballot, really give them the ballot, especially in the South, where blacks were the subject of all sorts of discrimination at the ballot box, often infamously required to count the jelly beans in a jar or recite the Constitution before they were allowed to vote. The Voting Rights Act slowly improved conditions in the South and across the country. Too often, this is where we stop with King's story. But this morning, I want to move on. Because friends, we know, don't we, that there is no progress on racial justice in the United States without a reaction. And in the year that President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, it seemed all hell broke loose. What some were calling the White Backlash was severe. Marchers in Chicago were pelted with trash and rocks, forced to walk between bigots waving Nazi flags in their faces. Watts erupted in riots. Civil rights workers were murdered in several southern cities. King wrote of attending their memorial services, "Many of us wept at the funeral services for the dead and for democracy." Many were asking, could the nation survive? Could there really be equality and freedom? Like the pundits of our own day, some journalists and others began to see clearly the causes for the 65 and 66 and 67 backlash. Black Americans had rioted in Watts. The slogan "Black Power" had risen to popularity in some places. Surely this stridency among the black community was leading whites to revolt. If they would just not say "Black Power," or if they would just not riot, or if they would just calm down and take things more slowly, if they could just be nice. King responded to that explanation in the book published the year before his death, entitled "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?" He said, "This pat explanation founders on the hard fact that the change in mood had preceded Watts and the Black Power slogan. Moreover, the white backlash had always existed underneath and sometimes on the surface of American life. No, the answers are both more complex and, for the long run, less pessimistic." He continues, "With Selma and the Voting Rights Act, one phase of development in the Civil Rights Revolution came to an end. A new phase opened, but few observers realized it or were prepared for its implications. For the vast majority of white Americans, the past decade, the first phase," he said, "had been a struggle to treat the Negro with a degree of decency, not equality. White America was ready to demand that the Negro should be spared the lash of brutality and coarse degradation. But it had never been truly committed to helping him out of poverty, out of exploitation, or all forms of discrimination. The outraged white citizen had been sincere," he says, "when he snatched the whips from the Southern sheriffs and forbade them more cruelties. But when this was to a degree accomplished, the emotions that had momentarily inflamed him melted away. White Americans left the Negro on the ground and in devastating numbers walked off with the aggressor. It appeared that the segregationist and the ordinary white citizens had more in common with one another than either had with the Negro." End quote. Many in the civil rights movement had envisioned true equality of rights with white people in housing, in employment, in every other part of life. Not just absence of violence, but equality. Selma was only to be a beginning. But when they came to the second phase, King said they felt abandoned. He wrote, "Negroes felt cheated, especially in the North. While many whites felt the Negroes had gained so much, it was virtually impudent and greedy to ask for more so soon." King had used the Selma moment with its bloody clash between black protesters and white police carried into living rooms via television to disrupt the accepted status quo. It was no longer polite not to say anything when people were being beaten bloody. But King could see that the next phase would be much more difficult. And it remains so. As journalist Sean McElwee wrote for an article in PBS, one of the underlying problems is that most Americans, but particularly young Americans, have a very confined view of what racism is. Americans think of racism as Bull Connor or the KKK, but today racism is far more likely to be embedded in institutions. Modern racism is not cross-burning, though that still happens. It's the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs only approving tax credits for housing in neighborhoods that are majority people of color, denying the credits in neighborhoods that are majority white. And while the Ferguson Police Department certainly contained racists, the more pervasive problem, he concludes, was a systematic, discriminatory method of policing that preyed on people of color. We should not delude ourselves that any form of racism has been eradicated. When I was in Selma in 2015, for the 50th anniversary of the marches there, KKK members were present and threw rocks wrapped in racist propaganda through the windows of some of the churches in which we were meeting. Just last year, a few miles away in Ahwatukee, some high school students thought it would be funny to spell out a racial epithet with letters on their t-shirts. And the rise in hate crime since the election is horrifying. No, even that most barbaric form of racism is still around. But King, in his last days, was calling for people to gather at the intersections of oppressions that are less visible. He was urging black Americans who were suffering to join with poor whites in working for equality in pay and housing, for example. He had come, it seems, to believe that liberation must be collective. And this was reflected in the subtitle of his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? Will we, he was asking, create chaos by fighting one another or join in community across identities to liberate one another? We can build on the foundation King laid and say that when straight people work for the rights of our LGBTQ kin, we are working for our own liberation. When middle-class whites work with poor people of all colors and backgrounds for immigrant rights, we're not just moving toward their freedom, but ours as well. There is, under all this and everything King did, an assumed equality of all people. And that was not new with King. The equality that King was calling for, I say, is what America has meant from the very beginning, but we've never quite achieved it. Last week I was in a seminar with Danielle Allen, Harvard professor of government, who recently wrote the book Our Declaration, about the writing of the Declaration of Independence. I didn't know until I heard from her that the Declaration of Independence is, in its way, an anti-slavery document. It's hidden in that famous sentence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." They could have said the pursuit of property ownership, and some argued for that language, which would have excluded everyone except white men. But the language that won out is the pursuit of happiness, which they were aware pertains to all people. And as the authors knew, it would open them up to criticism from abolitionists, who did indeed immediately seize on the hypocrisy of declaring that all people are endowed with these inalienable rights, even as some of the authors held slaves. Abolitionists also used the Declaration as a rallying cry in their publications. 2 paragraphs, anti-slavery, written by Thomas Jefferson, were edited out. These were people, I think, with deep personal conflict. And their conflict is reflected, I think, in our culture. Danielle Allen asserts that the duty of government is to make sure that the twin ideals of equality and freedom ensure that every person is able to equally pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Equality, she writes, is the foundation of freedom, because from a commitment to equality emerges the people itself, we the people, with the power both to create a shared world in which all can flourish and to defend it from encroachers. Some have misunderstood documents like the Declaration. They seize on the word freedom, and they think it means freedom from any encroachment from anyone or any law. They believe they have the right to do whatever they see fit without any thought of other people's freedom. That poisonous attitude is slowly choking our democracy. But what the authors were really saying is that equality and freedom have to go hand in hand, and sometimes the government has to step in to preserve that. What King was really saying is that equality is the foundation of freedom. Otherwise, if we are unequal in our ability to pursue life and liberty and happiness, then some of us are not truly free. then none of us is truly free. To the degree that every January we celebrate the Selma March, the King holiday is out of touch and is in fact an affront to the philosophy of the later king, maybe the wiser king, who called for true equality among the peoples of the world, a radical unity. This was the Martin Luther King Jr. of 67 and 68, the king who had tired of civility and niceness, had begun to see that America was in need of a battle for collective liberation. The liberation of poor people, of immigrants, of black Americans. Again, of course, we would add to the list LGBTQ folk and others. He wrote loose and easy language about equality. Resonant resolutions about brotherhood fall pleasantly on the ear. But for the Negro, there is a credibility gap he cannot overlook. He remembers that with each modest advance, the white population promptly raises the argument that the Negro has come far enough. Each step forward accents an ever-present tendency to backlash. Maybe that is what this election and the worldwide populist wave are really all about. People of color moving more freely around the globe, some searching for a safe place to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Regardless, we will be required in the days ahead to follow King's example, to speak hard words when they're called for, to band together with people who do not come through these doors, to stick to the work of collective liberation, remembering that we're all in this together. In the days to come and always, let us be not safe, but good. Amen.